First, thank you so much for this honor to present today. I'm thrilled and humbled to be presenting my paper titled Climate Change Concern Among Youth, examining the role of civics and institutional trust across 22 countries. In this paper, I sought to understand what elevates students' concern about climate change in different contexts. But first, I have to make a big thank you to Oren, my advisor, and the Center for Sustainable Futures. It has truly changed my life in a lot of ways. And to Daphna and colleagues from the Kibbutz College, it has been an amazing experience to work with both of you and to participate in this workshop series. And also to all those who have attended previously and are here now, thank you so much for joining today. And truly, this has been a great experience so far. So today, I concentrate on climate change and how there is growing concern among youth and adults about the climate crisis we are now facing. This picture here was drawn by 14-year-old Meghna. It's important to acknowledge that concern, worry, grief for the climate and our environment is a valid emotion that is impactful to our everyday lives. We know that the brunt of climate change and its impacts will be felt by future generations. And in fact, it's no surprise that we are seeing so many young people today leading social movements to call on governments and to address this issue now. And examining people's perceptions of different social, political, and environmental threats, such as climate change, is important to understand potential implications for policy choices, social change, and changing behavior. Today, I will present my paper that examines what elevates climate change concern. In order to better understand how perhaps curricular and co-curricular environmental opportunities in schools compared to other factors, such as promoting institutional trust and civic knowledge. I want to first highlight perhaps 3 reasons why I conducted the study and wanted to engage in this work. First, comparative evidence and understanding of youth concerns about climate change across different contexts is lacking. And second, trust is a growing topic of interest in relation to climate change, beliefs, behaviors, perceptions, and unpacking the role of trust in different institutions, such as national and international organizations, has yet to be earnestly examined among youth. And last, examining the link between environmental education, environmental sustainability education, and education for sustainable development approaches with levels of climate change concern can offer insight into potential pathways forward for practice. So today I'm going to chat about climate change concern and what previous literature has attributed to elevating concern among adults. And then I'll present my research questions and theoretical contributions. And I aim to walk through some of the findings from my paper and share with you patterns I observed and try and give them some context. And last, I want to reflect on these findings and share some of my thoughts, but mostly discuss them with you. This paper has made me reflect quite a lot about the usefulness of data and storytelling that I'm still attempting to improve on. And then last, we'll have a discussion in 3 parts or 3 different themes. We can get into detail about that later. So what is climate change concern exactly? In the literature, concern is often interchangeably used with notions of climate change risk or climate change threat as forms of perception. Concern can be a loaded word with multiple meanings, and most broadly, concern indicates perhaps an awareness and at least some understanding of the impacts of climate change. But most specifically, I refer to this to mean an individual's assessment of the potential environmental consequences or threats of climate change at all levels. So there are specific individual and contextual features from the literature that have been shown to affect levels of climate change concern among adults. And these include personal characteristics such as sex, age, country, political ideology. And among adult studies, specifically, they show that women are more likely to be concerned about climate change than men. However, most of these studies look at single case studies or countries that are in Western context, and it's not necessarily comparative. Second, educational opportunities have been shown to, or education in general has been shown to be directly related to perceptions about climate change, including concern. And how much people have learned and understand the causes and consequences of climate change and its impacts on people and planet is really important to unpack. And third, kind of challenging for me at least to unpack and see the link between concern and trust. But previous studies have shown that people's level of trust in different organizations, institutions, or people is related to notions of concern, awareness, or care about climate change, especially institutions in the form or serving as sources of information, as communicators, or as institutions that have capacity to actually address the issue at hand, like climate change. And so, and last, participation and engagement in community and civic issues is related to concern. It includes volunteering, campaigning, activism, and other behaviors such as being environmentally friendly. And along with this, studies have shown that people who are more civically engaged or have higher knowledge of this civic sphere are potentially more likely to be concerned about issues such as climate change. And these factors have been found to be important in adults and their perceptions about climate change. However, we know little about how kids and youth perceive climate change as a risk and what factors may elevate their concern more than others. In addition, we know little about how youth trust the sources where they can learn about climate change and its impact. This includes schools, but it also includes other levels such as local government, national government, and international orgs. Therefore, I asked two research questions. First, to what extent do curricular and co-curricular opportunities to learn about the environment and climate change shape students' levels of climate change concern? And curricular and co-curricular, I mean opportunities for them to learn inside school about climate change and the environment, and also opportunities to participate in activities that address these issues inside and outside school. And second, on trust, to what extent does trust in national and international institutions as sources of information shape student levels of climate change concern? To answer these questions, I draw from secondary data from the International Civics and Citizenship Survey from 2016. I think it's really interesting because this survey was collected 2015, 2016 during a pivotal time in many contexts in terms of climate change discussion and discourse. And I look at this data both cross-nationally and comparatively. Cross-nationally with all countries together, and then country to country to see if there's more nuanced relationships happening in the local levels. And I do this using logistic regression on over 82,000 eighth grade students in over 3,500 schools and across 22 contexts. And my main concern is looking at their level of climate change concern. And it's a question that asks, to what extent is climate change a threat to the world's future? And I'm examining this with student background predictors, curricular and co-curricular opportunities, and different levels of trust in institutions. The personal characteristics I use include their socioeconomic status, their sex, their aspirations for higher education, and their civic achievement scores. I also include 3 indicators for curricular and co-curricular opportunities. And I chose these 3 because they, at least to me, intersect approaches to education climate change ed, civics and citizenship, and also the various forms of sustainability education. And I look at specifically their opportunity to learn in school, activities that they do in school that are environmentally friendly, and if they are involved in any environmental action group, organization, or club. And last, I wanted to look at their levels of trust, to what extent they trust these institutions as sources of information. And they include the international level, which is the United Nations, their national government, their local government, and their school. The countries I include are listed here, and I'm limited to what countries were available through the secondary data. And it's important to note that a limitation, which is most of these countries are either middle or high income countries and are by no means representative. And so that is a limitation of my study. So let's go into the findings. First, I want to share with you kind of the breakdown of perceptions of climate change concern. Students answering, to what extent do you think climate change is a threat to the world's future? And here we can see almost 2/3 of all students in my sample and across 22 countries view climate change as a large threat or very concerned about climate change. And about 4 out of 10 students said none to a moderate extent. I then broke this question down by country. So it's a little wild, but bear with me. On the left-hand side are the countries, and going across each bar represents the proportion of respondents in each country to the question about climate change. And across the countries listed, they're indicating different levels of concern. And we can see that a majority of students in each country view climate change as a moderate or large threat, either the gray or the yellow, or the two sections on the left-hand side of the chart. But there's still quite a lot of variation here. We can see that a large majority of students in Colombia, Sweden, Finland, Hong Kong, and Chile have students who are concerned about climate change to a large extent. But on the other hand, on the bottom here, students from the Dominican Republic, Netherlands, Russia, Italy, Slovenia, Estonia, and Peru have a lot more variation in their students' perceptions. Cool. So when I looked at my models and the analyses, it was a lot to unpack and a lot to digest. So I'm attempting here to story it a little bit by first sharing with you the cross-national pattern in terms of their individual characteristics and their likelihood to be concerned about climate change. And I found that students with aspirations for post-secondary ed, higher SES, and higher civics and citizenship knowledge are more likely to perceive climate change as a large risk. However, what was surprising was girls are less likely than boys to be concerned. This is counter to previous literature among adults where women are generally more concerned about climate change than men. And so I went to the country level to compare across to see if this is the same direction for every country. And why is it doing that? Okay. What I found was a contradiction. First, more countries show that girls are less likely than boys to be concerned about climate change. And that's the arrow down and the list of countries here. But on the arrow up, meaning girls from Finland, Norway, and Sweden are more likely to be concerned about climate change. And so what I reflected on here was perhaps previous studies are limited because many studies are concentrated on Western countries or highly developed countries, and definitely does not show the full picture. And so there is a relationship here, perhaps for a local context or contextual information that is related to sex and climate change concern that we previously haven't really thought about because we haven't done comparative analyses. So a lot more needs to be unpacked here. And the rest here shows the same trend for higher ed goals, SES, and civic knowledge. The higher, the more likely to be concerned among these countries specifically. And it was funny, civic knowledge is important for all countries except Russia, and I don't know why, but I think the relationship is just really small. So when I looked at curricular and co-curricular opportunities, I found that students are more likely to perceive climate change as a large risk, or they're more concerned when they have greater opportunities to learn about protecting the environment in school. However, I did not find a relationship with the other two indicators, including participating in activities or in environmental groups or organizations. I was really surprised about this, and I hoped for something different. But there's a couple interpretations I have about this that might be contributing to there being no relationship. But most importantly, students who have the opportunity to learn in school about the environment have a higher likelihood of being concerned about climate change. And so the school is really important. The classroom is really important. When I looked at this by country, I find that a majority of countries in my study indicates so, that the opportunity to learn in the classroom is really important. And for the other two, only a few countries had any relationship with these activities, which include the Netherlands, Italy, and Mexico. Last, when I looked at trust in institutions cross-nationally, I found that students are more likely to perceive climate change as a large risk when they have higher trust in schools and the United Nations. But when it comes to trust in their national government, there's a negative relationship, meaning those who have higher trust in their national government are less likely to be concerned about climate change. And to put it the other way, those who have less trust in their national government have a higher likelihood of being concerned about climate change. And so what struck me here was kind of perhaps a relationship or an overlay with the notion of think local, or no, act local, think global. So this international sphere seems to be really important in terms of trust in information about climate change, and also elevating concern about climate change. And I also thought through perhaps maybe the national government there, it might be because, you know, national governments are often more directly responsible to addressing environmental issues, and there may be distrust there in being able to accomplish that, but that's totally an interpretation, and I would love to hear y'all's reflection on that. When I looked at it across countries, it was interesting to see that not only was the United Nations such a strong indicator for most countries in my study, but that it had such a positive and strong relationship. And so there's a lot more to discuss there, and I look forward to doing that today. In the trust in national government, the negative relationship I thought was also interesting, that most countries that have this relationship are either post-Soviet or post-socialist contexts. And so perhaps there are national government structure level forces that are happening there in terms of trust and climate change concern. But last, I really want to highlight this trust in schools. Only a few countries, a portion of countries, had a relationship there with elevating climate concern. And surprisingly, one, Estonia, had a negative relationship with that, where higher trust in schools meant a less likelihood of being concerned about climate change. So what does all this mean? Reflecting on it, opportunities perhaps do not uniformly contribute to raising youth concern for climate change across contexts. Different approaches such as EE, ESC, ESD traditionally focus on issues such as waste management, pollution, and sustainability more broadly, or environment, preservation. But there's perhaps potential limitations of these conventional approaches when efforts are not adequately linked to climate change or awareness and risk or concern. Civic knowledge is also related to awareness about climate change, which may not be immediately apparent. But civics curriculum may better align with tools needed to address climate change. Civics courses work to increase political efficacy and civic engagement, but also consider social implications of issues, and even maybe more science-focused issues such as climate change. And last, I promise last, I hope I'm not over time, but trust in institutions. Trust in sources of information, it really does play a key role in awareness about issues and elevating or diminishing concern or action about climate change. And I argue that perhaps cultivating trust in schools as these sources of information should be a high priority. It's important to raise awareness and concern to a degree and reduce skepticism about climate change. And I would love to open up a conversation about whether or not we should aim for raising concern among youth, or if there are other approaches or emotions that we should foster about these issues. And so last, I think what's so significant is the implications of how youth trust and gather information about climate change and the ways they trust the international discourse addressing its consequences. And future research should definitely explore how students gather information from different levels of institutions and how that information may shape their ideas about climate change. And so with that, I'll end. Thank you so much. And I look forward to discussing more about this and these different themes. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Erica. Let's open up for a quick round of questions, any clarifications or anything you want to ask Erica at this point before we go to the small group activity. You can raise your blue hand and I'll call you up. Ihab, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Oren, and thank you very much, Erica, for an excellent presentation and for this whole series. Just a quick question for clarification, please. I think on the slide titled curricular and co-curricular, you listed 3 bullet points: learning, participating, and then a 3rd point. So I was just wondering what the distinction is between learning and the participating. Were you referring to perhaps learning simply very theoretically about climate change with no hands-on engagement, while participating was engaging maybe in student clubs and so on? If you can just maybe shed some light on that. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you for the question. Yes, I'll say two things. First, yes, so the opportunity to learn strictly is about whether kids open a textbook and they're reading about the environment and climate change. And the other 2 are more measuring how students act on that, or perhaps they're not learning about it in the classroom perhaps, but there are activities within the school that are related to environmental issues or climate change. And the participating in the organization or club, same deal. But like you highlighted, they kind of overlap in some ways, right? Participating means you're also learning. And so that's a great observation and question, because in terms of running the analysis, perhaps that's why some don't have a relationship and the opportunity to learn stands out. And I did do additional just isolated analysis to look at one and then the other and then the other. And unfortunately, perhaps the measurement is just not as good because it still was the same pattern. So I'd be happy to share that with you if you're interested. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. That's great.
Thank you. You have Bright Flame.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Erica. Wonderful presentation. I'm wondering about representation in the sample from the global south and the nations that would be, really are feeling impacts already from climate change. I would expect a relationship and concern among youth, but I just kind of scanning the countries quickly, it looked like mostly sampling from the global north. And another question, or just a comment, that it would be interesting to see among all the different countries the level of active youth movements, like not related to schools, like fire drill Fridays, or whatever Greta Thunberg's group is called, which countries might be more active, and if that's ramping up youth concern.
Great question and observation. Yeah, so you just outlined my agenda for the rest of my life in terms of research. Yeah, so that was one thing that felt uncomfortable in some ways, that in a limitation of data gathering, especially secondary data analysis, is that you're only limited to what they have collected. And the ICCS survey is done by IEA, which is a European and American organization primarily. And those countries who participate in this survey are often, and Oren can explain this in a lot more eloquent detail, but there's some like implications there in terms of which countries participate and which ones don't. And unfortunately, that means a lot of global South countries are not participating in this survey. But it would be wonderful to have a follow-up study to see if countries from different areas of the world are have similar relationships to concern. But also, you bring up another point, which is something I really feel should be looked at as well, is the experience of climate change and their concern. And there's a couple ways I could do that. There are kind of international measurements of levels of natural disaster or climate change, surface temperature wise, that I could add into analysis to see if there's a relationship there. But you're right, those who are, for instance, in the Arctic or, in the equator, experiencing drastic changes in climate would definitely impact concern. And then the second thing, yeah, that's another thing that could be added into it, the level of activity youth have in each country, and perhaps raising that concern through a social movement perspective. I'd have to figure out how to do that. Perhaps the next ICCS, once it's released, I'd be able to. But thank you so much for those questions and comments.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bright Flame. I would just say that, Erica, what I heard Bright Flame saying, you can also flip it and look at whether the data that you have from 2016 is a predictor of the Greta Thunberg Friday for Futures that happened a couple of years after. I think that will be interesting just to look at the correlation between the two to see whether these attitudes really matter for activism. But that's, as you said, that's your research agenda for the coming decade. Julie, go ahead.
Yes, hi. I was wondering, was there anything in the study that addressed the trust in news agencies? I'm thinking about what's happening, at least in the U.S. I noticed U.S. wasn't one of those countries, but but we get a lot of our information from, variety of news agencies. So I was curious about that.
Oh man, y'all are just really lining out my agenda. I'm taking notes, so I'll definitely be included. But yes, I wanted to include that, but it felt too much for one paper or one study, a limitation perhaps of the publication practices, but yes, so there are questions and indicators about trust in news and also use of news information, either traditional like paper print or social media. And so that's a whole nother aspect to explore in terms of gathering information from news media and elevated concern. So that's definitely another thing to look into that is really important, especially because the current movements by youth heavily involve social media, and social movements in general rely a lot on news media coverage to communicate the issue. And so, yeah, great observation and question on that. And I'll definitely look into that. Yeah.
Thank you, Julie. We have time for one more question before we move to this small breakout groups.
I would like to ask a question.
Please go ahead, Nava.
Okay. My question is, how do you build the trust, and especially in education with young children? I think that we have to bring it closer to them. Like, they probably need to ask, what does it have to do with me? How I'm getting involved in it? I've seen a film about 7 women that influenced the nature world for the better, and they showed their women, African women, they were like 14 and they didn't have any future. They knew that they're going to be married with a violent husband and so on. And there was a woman who gave them a lot of power, inner power to become somebody. And they, in the end, learned and influenced their close environment. So my interest is how this global issue and trust are going to meet the individual.
Wow, what a wonderful question. And thank you for sharing that powerful story. I don't know. I do know that trust is important, but I don't know how that could be built, especially within schools, or especially at the international level, perhaps, through institutions like the UN. I think there are colleagues here perhaps that are much more experienced and knowledgeable about notions of building trust. And I definitely would invite conversation about that and to learn from you. Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. So I think we'll stop here. I think, thank you, Erica, for the fabulous talk and for getting us started. Erica, why don't you share with us what's the plan for the small group activity?
Sure. So let me share my screen once again. So I kind of set up discussion in 3 parts. And you can choose whichever one in your group that you most resonates with you. Is this okay? Can you see okay, great. So first theme I thought perhaps might be interesting to discuss is the benefits and consequences of climate change concern. So please feel free to share with your group how climate change has impacted the way you feel. How's concern about climate change impacted you? Does concern drive action or action drive concern? That's kind of what we discussed in Q&A just a moment ago too. And should feelings of concern or grief be a part of climate change curriculum? Is it good to encourage concern? Is kind of an existential question of mine. And then second, benefits and consequences of trust. So Nava, this is definitely your wheelhouse in terms of what we had just discussed. What role does the building of trust play into sustainability education? And what kinds of institutions do you trust or not trust, and why? Why is trust important? And can we as educators increase trust in institutions? And I say specifically the UN, but also you feel free to discuss any kind of level. And last, what's the use of ILSA's international large-scale assessments and quantitative analysis, or using numbers in sustainability education? And how can large-scale assessments and numbers inform our practice? And what are the potential limitations of numbers and storytelling and sharing information that can be complicated? So yeah, these are the three themes. And I'm going to share with you a Google Doc that you can use to write notes and kind of organize your thoughts. I'm just going to copy the link real quick.
What I was concerned is, how do we make the authorities aware of the effect on the individual and on the education? And I got an answer that there are students involved in marching, and politicians sometimes get involved, and we have to do more and more of that to make the authorities involved in their responsibility. Because what we can, I mean, money is making the whole difference, but we cannot buy with money what we destroy.
Right.
Yeah, and I'll just pick up on that because I was the one who brought up about the marches. I've participated in some of those climate change marches, or it was before the pandemic, active with the groups like the Food and Water Watch, and like interacting to. And I didn't do enough of this, but interacting with certain politicians, you can at least sort of suss out some of the politicians that are at least open to listening to us or like-minded. About some issues that we think are, we feel are important to us when it comes to climate change or use of fossil, or trying to divest from use of fossil fuels and so on. Because unfortunately we've got this discourse between, the politicians, for whatever reason, like no to climate change, no to a whole slew of things. And you just got to keep pushing back at that. And try to really make them aware that the country, the politic are not in the same place that some of those people are, and just keep pushing at it.
And I think to connect that back to students that we were talking about a little bit in our group was just this need to balance out like concern for the consequential issue or matter with action, and like action that's authentic and genuine and like that's driven by students, and so that they are able to find spaces to make differences. And we know that climate change is huge, and it's it's hard sometimes to convince kids that like this small little action will make a difference. But I like even hearing Julie, right, like she's got joy in her voice, she's got excitement about having done something, and I think that this can be an infectious way to balance out that concern that we want to also develop in our students.
Yeah, to go. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead, Garrett.
Please, Darren, you go.
You got it. So this is something that we talked about in our group about how sometimes concern and anxiety and fear can actually be crippling to students, and feeling like, well, I can't do anything, so I'm not going to do anything. And we spoke a bit about how Daphne raised a really good question around how can academics, like Erica's research, be communicated to communities who can actually leverage that information, and how do we match that gap between the information produced in academia to public? And I think what we were discussing is that I think researchers have to take the extra step of not just saying, go read the paper, and being slightly dismissive in our assumption of the perhaps data literacy of the public, of the different groups who may really benefit from reading our research and also the information we put a lot of time into and effort into producing, and communicating with care. And I think Erica took a lot of time and effort to be able to explain what relationships are existing within the data, and also thinking about communication when it comes to particular kinds of populations. Like, for example, certain information in the data might really resonate with students compared to transportation workers, compared to policy stakeholders, and matching the interest to how this actually affects their life and making that really close coupling. So I think then that inspires concern and inspires action when the information is communicated with care and kindness to say, this is how it actually matters. and this is why we should do something about it, to the people who are perhaps in your purview and portfolio. So we were talking about this because yes, all this matters, but then how does it come down to the communication aspect of it, and how can we say this matters to so many people?
Yeah, the theme of empowerment was spoken about in our group a lot as well. And I've always had a concern with teaching young people about climate change, about introducing concepts when they're very young that are quite broad and quite serious. And so I expressed that concern in the group, and there were some really great practical solutions about how you can work around that, which I'll add to the doc. But one struck me in particular was Vicky's idea that criticality is key, and that you can teach criticality, for example, through problem solving from a very young age as a sort of generic thing that doesn't have to be linked to sort of serious, scary issues, could just be personal issues. And then as kids get older, if they have those critical skills, those problem solving skills, they can then apply them to other things more broadly, like local sustainability and global sustainability. So I thought that was a really interesting idea.
Yeah, one thing that we said, having to do with concern, we agree that scaring students isn't the best, but concern, they're aware of what's going on anyway, whether it be through the TV or whether they live near an area where there's fires, whether they're having an impact on fires. And so I think we need to address young children. And one thing that I had seen in working with even very young children is that if you have them focus on certain problems within their own neighborhood, within their own school, within their own street, and focus on what maybe the solutions could be, or introduce them to different things that they might be interested in, animals, polar bears, birds, and why these might be decreasing and why we might not be seeing them quite as much, is a really good way of getting them involved, even in starting to counting how many monarch butterflies do you see each year in your backyard, because there's certainly been a decrease around here. All these things are great ways of getting kids involved. And I feel personally that concern drives action, and that action increases concern, and it's a spiraling process.
Yeah, I think project-based research with any age kids, like going outside and measuring, the stream level that's at historic highs or historic lows, and what that means, and whose yard has flooded or who doesn't have water. So doing the actual field research with them, devising questions, and then taking that out to somebody who can do something about it, as a form of action, like maybe visiting their local legislator, their local city agency with what they found, a group of school kids, bringing that will kind of help make that next step so they feel empowered. Yeah.
If I think it was Nava earlier that mentioned, and Darren echoed that, the need to bridge the academia with the policymakers. And there is another group of stakeholders that we might want to look at. It's not only the kids, but Erica has another sub-storyline in the findings about how kids from more affluent background care more or are more concerned. And I found that to be somewhat counterintuitive. It's not a simple finding. And I was wondering whether communicating this to policymakers, that, hey, there is a gap at age 14, that kids with more resources care more about this topic versus others, I think that's something to communicate to policymakers. So Erica, I'm not sure how exactly you will do that, and I'm sure we can find a way to do that through the center, but I think that's something to communicate to policymakers, that there is an issue here with socioeconomic differences with concerns on climate. I think that's really important. That's catchy. But I'll be quiet. Virginia, go ahead.
Wow.
Hello. I do agree with Vicky and others that talked about introducing slowly problems in your community. But for me, the bottom line is you don't love what you don't know. So you have to protect what you love. So you need to start the foundation of loving Mother Earth, of loving each other. That should be the first foundation in our early childhood education. And the problems will arise, you can introduce problems, but the minds of kids, they can really, we can blow up problems and really not sleep or not eat and really be concerned with a small problem that they cannot solve. So I think letting the fear maybe arise later, it will be better. And start really the foundation with love, love the earth, love the other. I think we'll be doing a better job for our children. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, everybody.
I really love this discussion, and I love that the themes are overlapping with each other as we're talking. I wanted to maybe bring up another interpretation that I didn't share in the presentation that it relates to what y'all are saying about, there's other emotions involved in terms of climate change. There's joy, there's concern, but then there's also empowerment. And I think these things are not exclusive from each other. And what y'all were talking about in terms of empowerment and then being concerned and then being able to do action about that, I think is critical. And, what I see as a limitation too with using data and numbers to impart a story is that you lose some of that nuance and the interpretation part. If the storyteller is not a good storyteller. But, there's this other side of it too, where perhaps concern is something that is normalized. So, just because there's no relationship in my study between participating in environmentally friendly things or being a part of an environmental club and climate change concern doesn't mean that there isn't an underlying relationship there, where perhaps those who are doing things, participating in activities, seeing it around their schools, the risk or the concern is normalized, where like, yes, I'm concerned, but I'm not overly concerned or scared or worried because we're doing something about it. Which is another aspect I think to explore in terms of, what is the role of worry or concern here in climate change ed, environmental ed, and sustainability. Yeah, just wanted to share that. Other thoughts, reflections? Oyagoga?
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor. Once again, I'm Oyagoga Unu, and I'm an educator at Wesley High School, Nigeria here. My concern really is that the environment, that is the environment where we need change, has a relationship with the economic situation that is happening in that environment. Our human instinct, our human nature is to protect our life first before we think of anything outside ourselves. So mostly you will find that in good educational systems or good national systems like Finland, for example, and the likes, you find out that economy there has little challenges. And so people are happy. People are, comfortable to even begin to think of the environment. So this factor of the locality where change is needed having an influence on people's attitude towards action or acting for the climate really, really matters. So that researchers or government staff who are responsible for educating the masses or enforcing certain laws need to use these findings so that they localize their actions. So this is my concern, that what works in a particular society or locality is quite different in how it will work in another place. So that contextual setting has to be well planned, well thought of before the necessary measures to build, that trust in impacting for the environment will come about. So this is my perspective, my reflection about bringing an effective and efficient sustainability approach in our schools, in our environment, in our countries. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you so much, Oyogoga, and thank you, Erica, for facilitating. Daphna, any other comments before we wrap up the final session of the first season?
I think we can wrap up.
Okay. Julie, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just want to say, I'm going to what was just said a minute ago. I'm thinking about like how, like at least in the U.S., the importance of voting, is so critical here because, there are, obviously some politicians that are aware of climate change for many years and trying to do their bit, but they're keeping stymied because you've got another political bloc that are just really standing in the way. So that's also, like ties into all of this and obviously ties into the economic issues, and the green, the whole discourse right now with the infrastructure, with the, like trying to put in green, infrastructure, how it is, a lot of that got separated out, and most of it wasn't even allowed in the bipartisan plan, much of its ends being tucked into the other plan. And who knows how, much buy-in there's going to be at the end of the day on that. Hopefully we'll make headway, but that's also part and parcel of all of this. So just wanted to, mention that again, because this is a critical piece to, how far we can move. Look what, we had Obama in office in 2008 and he couldn't get anywhere, even when he had control of the Senate and the Congress at a higher level than what we have even today. So, and, getting to a critical point, 2008 was bad enough, and now it's, that much more critical that we make a move.
Okay, thank you so much, Julie. And thank you everybody for joining us for another session.